3 months ago, BMW UK dropped off this Toronto red manual G87 M2. And since then, I've covered 3,500 mixed miles in it, including taking it out to Germany and the Nürburgring. And on that trip, I shot a video comparing today's Baby M against the 1M, which was the Baby M of 2010. If you missed that video, there'll be a link to it up here. The new and used car market has changed quite a lot here in the UK over the past 3 months, including a lot of those popping up online. So before I get too cold, let's jump inside, talk about the good, the bad, and whether I think it still looks like it's made out of Lego. Before we head out, I want to play around with some of the setup of this car to configure it so that it's perfect for me. And some of that is positive and some of it is negative. The first thing I've done is press the setup button down here, and it has brought up this lovely setup menu with lots of engine, chassis, brake configurations, just like you'd get in the M3 and the M4. You also get the fantastic 10-way M traction control system. By default, everything is backed off in efficiency or comfort, and the traction control and stability control is fully on. And that means my M1 button is now configured and set to bring up all of my favorite settings for on the road. And I play around and adjust those depending on the conditions and the time of year. So if we press M1 once and then press it again, you might actually hear the exhaust note change slightly there. It'll bring up all of my favored settings and the settings that I'll be driving this car in today. So the engine has gone up from efficient to sport, so it basically gives me a bit more throttle response, but not too much, because I've found you don't want too much. Sport Plus in these conditions is just a little bit too much. Remember, this has got 460 horsepower, probably closer to 500 horsepower in reality, and that's a lot to run through a set of rear tyres in freezing conditions. The gear shift assistant I have on, but I can turn that off, unlike in the predecessor, the F87, that would be on all of the time unless you turn traction and everything completely off, and then it would turn off. I always wish that the F87 had a button that you could play around with, because as much as I love doing heel and toe myself, especially on track, on the road I don't want to have to deal with that all the time, so I leave that on. Chassis is in comfort. This is a really stiffly sprung car. Not overly stiff, but it's stiff enough to run in comfort on a typical UK road, especially in these conditions, because you want the car to be as supple as possible to find those grip levels. Steering comfort, because when you put it into sport it just becomes even heavier and you lose even more feeling out of it. The brake in sport, because sport just gives you a bit more assistance with your braking, means you don't have to push really hard, and I find that they're more consistent when it's in sport than when it's in comfort, because in comfort sometimes they'll feel really bitey and other times not so much. And then the M traction control I've actually got on level 3. In my M3 X Drive, I have that in 4-wheel drive sport with everything switched off. But in these slippery, slightly icy conditions, I do like the car to help me a little bit when I'm on the road, just in case I run out of talent altogether. If I was to go out on track, all of that would be switched off, because any kind of traction control or stability control helping you on track just causes heat and wear issues, and I find this M traction control system to be incredible. Now let's get on to the not so exciting setup part of this car and many exciting sports cars that are sold in 2023, the Bings and the Bongs. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll probably know exactly what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, the G87 is plagued with them. And that is not BMW's fault. That is unfortunately something that they have to do as part of new European laws and legislations. The first one is the speed limit bong. Now, I have talked about this briefly on the channel before. Basically, anytime you go even close to the speed limit, 1 mile an hour over, you get a bong in the cabin. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should speed or that I speed, but when you're following flowing traffic through a 50 and you touch 51 miles an hour, you get an annoying bong. Thankfully, there are a couple of ways to switch this off. If you come out of setup menu and into your apps and then hit driver settings and into driver assistance, if we go down here to warning for speed limits, you can see there it's switched on because it's blue, and we can switch that off. Now, if you hold that down, that will actually allow you to add it to your shortcuts. Now, I've already done that. What does that mean? So let's just go back to setup menu or wherever you are. Now, if I swipe down, I can turn my speed limit warning off and on. So that's the first thing you do when you get in this car. Swipe down, turn that off. The next thing you do is you turn off the lane departure warning. The lane departure warning, to me anyway, just seems to want to pull you into oncoming traffic. It works really well if road markings and roads are perfect, but here in the UK, neither of those are perfect, and as a result the car gets confused as to where it is sometimes, and I've had it where it's pulled the wheel out of my hands quite literally and scared the life out of me. So although it's meant to be a safety aid, and I'm sure for some drivers out there and for some countries it might help them, as far as I'm concerned, just turn that off, because yeah, it's put me in some sticky situations. And thanks to an Instagram follower, H6VRY_M2, well, they let me know you can actually switch off that speed limit bong by just holding down the set button. So that will deactivate speed limit warning activated. If I hold it down again, speed limit warning deactivated. And the last thing to talk about before we finally get this car out on the road is something that's been introduced lately on an over-the-air update. You see, when I was in Australia, my good friend Andy looked after this car for a few weeks. And when I got back, he told me about this annoying bonging sound. And I said, oh, it's the speed limit thing. Did you not turn it off? Because I showed him about the shortcuts. He said, no, it's not that. It's something else. So we went for a little drive. And every time you go between speed limit changes, so you're leaving a village from a 30 into a 50, dong, and you get to a dual carriageway, which is a 60, dong, and back into a 40, dong, it just does it each and every time. And the worst thing about that is if you've got your sound system on, so you're listening to the radio or Spotify, the Drive Talk podcast, if you've got good taste, it will semi-mute what you're listening to give you that bong. And once again, massive shout out to H6VRY_M2, who reached out to me and showed me that you can thankfully turn that off, and also thankfully it stays off. And to access that, once again, come out the setup menu, into driver settings, into driver assistance, and then we come down here to warning for speed limits, sound when limit changes. Now turn that off, and as I've done, I've added that to my shortcuts, but I found that I don't need to, because thankfully once you've got that off, let's just show it there, it's off and it doesn't seem to come back on, whereas the warning when speeding, well, that does come back on every single time you turn the engine off. In fact, let's just demonstrate that now. So off, on, swipe down, there you go. Warning when speeding, straight back on, but the sound when limit changes is thankfully still off. Lane departure warning is back on again. So off, swipe back down again, lane departure, yes, deactivate, there we go. Now we can pull away. I'm sure everyone has seen Chris Harris's recent M2 video. Absolutely brilliant, and great to see him doing what he does best. And also great to see him praising this little car, because as with so many modern M cars, it's had good and bad press, but mostly good. And I know a lot of the bad has been focused around its styling, which definitely grows on the majority of people. The more I see out on the road, especially when I was in Australia, I saw so many, and of those cars, the owners that have made small little tweaks, usually in the region of lowering the car slightly, putting 10-12 mil spacers all round, makes a huge difference to how this sits on the road and how it looks. It's very, very slippery today. There's icy patches out there. So you've got to really have your wits about you. But I'm really glad and thankful that I have Michelin's Pilot Sport 4S tyres on this car, and it's actually great to see that the majority of the G87s were delivered on Michelin PS4Ss, and the Star Mark tyre as well, the homologated tyre that was specifically designed to work with the current G Series M cars. Like so many modern sports cars on sale today, the G87 does the normal car thing so well. And what I mean by that is, when you jump in this car and you want it to just get you from A to B without any fuss and without trying to throw you into the closest field, well, it goes about that really well. When everything's knocked back and in default, like we looked at earlier on, when you fire it up, it's just a car at that stage. And I don't mean that in a bad way or a negative way, I mean that in a positive way. You see, the predecessor of this, the F87, the M2 that I've got, and there will be an update on that coming very soon, that car was great when you were wringing its neck, and it was okay as a daily, but it wasn't brilliant. It was a bit harsh in terms of ride. You couldn't adjust. It didn't have adaptive suspension like this one, and it just didn't ever feel that happy running around as a normal car. It did feel happy being ragged along your favourite road, whereas this newer version, well, it feels happy doing both of those. It has a real Jekyll and Hyde character, and I think that is really commendable to BMW M, because their current M3 and M4 are exactly the same. I remember when I drove those cars at the UK launch, and I remember thinking, wow, they do both normal car and sports car in one package, and that must be really difficult to achieve. But the M2 does that all day long. In terms of if you were running it as your daily and as your only car, would you use these seats? Would you use the manual gearbox? Well, everyone has their own personal preferences, and I do get asked that regularly. In fact, the most regular question I get asked about this car is, what colour should I have my G87 in? Now, please, I don't mind helping people with their spec choices, but I can't help you with the colour choice. Colour is very personal. And while we're talking about colours, there are a couple of optional frozen paint colours on the configurator now too, so let's hope that next year BMW throw a couple of extra colours at the M2, because I'd love to see it in some alternative shades. But in terms of the seats and the gearbox, well, the manual gearbox in this is brilliant. I do think it's the same box that was in the F87 and in cars like the M140i, but they have definitely improved something. Maybe the linkage, or I don't know, the bushing. It just feels a little bit better, but it still feels unmistakably rubbery and BMW M. It's no Porsche manual gearbox, and it's no Civic Type R box, but it is very good. The downsides with it, like most manual option cars, is when you're in sixth at 80 miles an hour, it's revving at around 3,000 RPM, which means that the engine is consuming a lot of fuel. In fact, on longer runs, you'll struggle to see 30 miles to the gallon with this manual car, but I'm sure if you're in the 8-speed auto, you would see at least 35, maybe 37, 38 on longer runs. And I know a lot of people might not think that's a big deal, but when you're paying for today's fuel prices, or if you're going on much longer road trips, then it will come into its own. Looks quite slippery. Yep. Yes. Now let's talk about these seats. As you know, I'm a big fan of BMW's carbon bucket seat, but they're not for everyone. They do fit the majority of shapes out there, but they are sometimes a pain to live with. Also in the G87, they come as part of a £9,000 package. It might even be more than that now. So I think that's put off a lot of people, whereas if you're getting an M3 or an M4, you can still buy them independently to any other options, and I think in those cars they sit just under £4,000, which is still a lot of money, but it's less than half the price of what you got to pay if you want them in the M2. And I've seen the uptake on these seats in this car, unsurprisingly, is quite low, because, well, that's about 15% of what this car retails at. Do they work with the manual box and the seriously offset pedals? Well, you do get a few issues with this codpiece holder rubbing against the inside of your leg, and you notice that in the first couple of drives. But because I've had this car for 3 months, I've completely stopped even realizing. It's only when I look down and I see the seat looks like it's pointing to the left and the pedals are coming in from the right, so there is quite an offset there. But as I say, you very quickly become used to it. I think it will affect some people more than others, but I guess if you're going manual, then the sort of standard M Sport seat, which is also very, very good, is probably the way to go. In terms of gearboxes themselves, once again, a bit like the DCT and the F87, the ZF 8-speed automatic gearbox in this G87 is almost undoubtedly the better all-round gearbox. It gives you more cogs, you can access the torque and power more frequently from that brilliant S58. You get lovely paddles. I mean, the gear shifts, although it is a traditional automatic box, as we know, the ZF 8-speed has just got better and better and better over the years, and the shift times are really, really good. They're not quite DCT, but they're really commendable, and I don't think many people are going to be disappointed with the ZF 8-speed. It also gives you far more efficiency, as we talked about earlier on, and if you're using your car as a daily and you just want to jump in it and drive it, I don't know, down to the shops and back, the Auto obviously is the play it safe. But there's no denying that having a manual box just gives you that engagement, and when you do head out for a nice blast of a drive along your favourite road, well, I tell you, this box has been an absolute joy to live with. Where it wasn't a joy was when we went out to Germany and you're sitting on the motorway for 6 or 7 hours and it's revving away, like I said, especially in France where the speed limit's closer to 90 miles an hour. The fuel consumption is tragic, and because this has a slightly smaller fuel tank, it had a realistic range of about 220 miles, which is almost sort of EV levels. But thankfully, unlike an EV, you can pop into a petrol station, which there are plenty of, and it takes you about 4 minutes to give you a full charge once again. What limiter? Well, it appears this G87 M2 doesn't have a limiter. Wow. Now let's talk about the ride and handling. This car is on the same staggered wheel setup as the M3 and M4. So we have 19-inch wheels on the front axle and we have 20s on the rear. As talked about earlier on, the M2 now comes standard with the M adaptive suspension, and I've found that in all conditions on UK roads you should be in comfort. Sport isn't uncomfortable, but it just sort of gives you back that edge that our UK roads tend to have, whereas in Comfort it takes away that edge and it actually makes the car feel relatively supple, but most importantly it still gives you plenty of support even during the summer months. Oh, let's slow down for these horses. Even during the summer months where you really load the car up, it's fine in Comfort. I'm sure the second you take this out on track, you'll probably want to put it into Sport or Sport Plus, where the surface is much better and the car's not getting disturbed by, you know, ruts and cracks and potholes mid-corner. But on a UK road, it's really, really good. It is helped once again by the fact that this car has the Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tyres, because as for the M3 and M4, when you get the P0s on there, they've got stiffer sidewalls, and as a result you feel a lot more through the chassis and the seat, the wheel of the car, and that does become a little bit tiresome after a while. But, and there is a but, unfortunately all of the G series M cars, my M3 Touring, this M2, even cars like the fantastic M4 CSL, they all lack steering feel. We know it's an E-Pass system, but BMW just don't seem to have got it right with this car as far as I'm concerned. You can't feel what is going on underneath you. When you're really pushing it in the middle of summer or on a track day, you can feel what's going on when there's maximum forces going through it. But on a day like today where there's next to no grip outside, it's really difficult to feel what's happening with the front axle. And before you know it, you're understeering. You just can't feel the surface of the road. You can feel the rear end rotate and you can feel what's going on with the car in terms of its angle. These seats add feel back to the car. It's almost like you're in a go-kart, because with the buckets you are sitting almost on the chassis, whereas with the M Sport seats, you know, there's almost a dampener between the two of you. But in terms of the actual steering feel, it's just not there. The way this steers is really impressive. The steering rack is lovely and fast and allows you to catch big angles nice and quickly. And it's not something that's going to ruin this car and your ownership, but it's definitely something that's worth knowing about, because let's say Porsche's Cayman, well, although that's also an E-Pass system, you get a lot more feel through the wheel of that than you do with this. Some of that might have to do with the overly fat rim on the wheel, and yes, I have mentioned that once again in one of my videos. Continuing on with the handling dynamics of this car, I remember when I went out to Austria and the Salzburg Ring for the pre-production drive of the G87, and the first thing that stood out to me was the fact that it didn't quite have the front end of the M3 and the M4. And let me just caveat that by saying the current M3 and M4, as I've said so many times in so many videos, is one of the best, if not the best front end I've ever experienced. In fact, the 992 GT3 RS that I tried recently at the Porsche Silverstone Experience Centre, well, unfortunately that's taken top spot, as you can imagine. But aside from that, and maybe the 992 GT3, the M3 and M4 are just incredible. This car doesn't quite have that front end, and it's weird because it shares pretty much all of the suspension componentry. Okay, they've changed the spring rate slightly, and it shares the same front tyres, essentially the same 275 section Pilot Sport 4S tyres. So you've got the same, or you should have the same mechanical grip, but it just doesn't feel quite as good. But when you're on the road, that, along with the slightly different spring rates and the fact that this M2 has a shorter wheelbase than the M3 and the M4, well, that plays into its favour, because it actually becomes more playful. It feels like it's having more fun at slower speeds, which is definitely a good thing and a good recipe for road cars. But I'm sure if you compared this against the current M4 at a circuit like Silverstone on the same tyres, well, the M4 would probably be about 2 or 3 seconds a lap quicker. And that's not just because it has a little bit more power and torque, it's because it has that magical front end that this doesn't quite have. It also has more stability due to the slightly longer wheelbase. And that kind of does show you that the M4 is still a more superior, let's call it, sports car in terms of outright pace and ability. But the M2 is more fun on the road at more sensible speeds, if that makes sense. And I think that was exactly the case with the previous M2, the F87, when you compared that against the F82 M4. And the fact that BMW have managed to get that right with a car that, let's face it, has almost identical ingredients is really, really commendable. And I've really enjoyed my time with this car, and I am going to miss it when it's gone, but it does mean that I get to spend more time behind the wheel of my touring, which I really haven't spent much time in recently. So it's not all doom and gloom. I don't expect any of you to feel in the slightest bit sorry for me, but the fact that I am going to miss it does tell you that it's a fantastic bit of kit. Before I give you my complete conclusion, I want to pass on a few messages from my mate Andy, who had this car whilst I was in Australia. And although he wasn't driving it all the time because he was looking after it, I did ask him to give me some honest feedback, because Andy's a fantastic driver, he's one of my best friends, and he knows what he's talking about. And I think it's really good and important to get an independent point of view where you can. So his positives are, it's fast. It's very, very fast. He had a manual M140i until about a year ago, so he's used to pretty punchy cars. He's driven a few of my cars over the years, but he said this is seriously fast, verging on being too fast for the road, and I would agree with that. It is just lightning fast. If you stir this box and you rev it all the way out, it's just ridiculously quick. Next thing, he loves these seats. He's also very tall like me, lanky frame. He loves the driving position. He said they're just wonderful, but he also picked up on the fact that they are so offset, or the pedals are so offset compared to these fixed bucket seats, and you really do feel that offset more in these seats because you're in a fixed position more than you would be if you were in the standard or regular M Sport seats. He loves the manual box. He is a manual lover. His M140 was manual, but he said it definitely feels a little bit better in this car, which is exactly what I've taken away from it. And his final positive are this car's looks, and Andy really wasn't sure on the new M2 when it came out sort of 6 months ago, 8 months ago. He was one of the, not doubters, but he kind of sat on the fence. He really wasn't sure. It's still slippery down there. But he thinks it looks really good, and he said the more time he spent with it, every morning he would walk out on the way out to work and he would see it there, it really grew on him. And when he washed it, he said you saw new angles coming in, etc, etc. So in terms of the styling, he's really been won over by it. He doesn't like the Toronto red, but I get that this red colour is not for everyone. I'm not sure if I love it, and I certainly wouldn't have my M2 in Toronto red, but it's still a nice colour all the same. And as we talked about earlier on, I just hope that BMW give us a bit more of a palette moving into 2024. Its negatives, well, the list is quite short. The bongs, as we talked about earlier on, all of these noises and sounds that once you've set the menus up are easy enough to deactivate, but annoying, and something that if you go back a few years just didn't sort of exist in cars, and that is something that we're all going to have to live with. And as I said right at the start of the video, that is not BMW's problem, that's not BMW's fault. that is something that they have to do now with all their modern cars. And the other negative was the fact that it is big. He's got an F31 3 Series, and he reckons there's absolutely no difference in size, and in fact this car feels and is wider. So it's a big car to pilot along your favourite UK road, but once again, all modern cars are just getting so big and so inflated. I guess it's time for me to give you my conclusion, and I'm assuming that most of you already know that I absolutely love this car. I loved it from the first time I tried that pre-production car a long time ago, and I love it after I've lived with one for 3 months. And while I'm on that, big shout out and thanks to the BMW UK press team for allowing me to do what I've done with this car, and hopefully feed back as much information to you lot as possible. We all know car pricing has gone absolutely nuts in the past 12 months, and I'm not suggesting that £65,000 for a BMW 2 Series is the bargain of a century, but I am suggesting that this is a brilliant car for the money, especially when you compare it to other sports cars out there that have a similar sort of power output and package. It looks good on paper, and I can tell you from my 3 months behind the wheel that it's really good to live with. It does pretty much everything. Something else you could throw into the mix is the M4 X-Drive. If you were to pick up the 12-month-old one of those, they would also set you back about £65,000 with a couple of thousand miles on the clock. So it's definitely something that's worth considering. But as a road car, I personally think that the M2 is more fun more of the time. That's not saying it is more of a car. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you enjoyed my end of term video with this G87 M2. I'll see you at another one very, very soon. Cheers.